90% of Christian wealth doesn't just decline, it vanishes by the third generation. Most families spend decades building a net worth only to have it destroyed by the prodigal syndrome. But here's what your financial advisor isn't telling you. This isn't a money problem, it's a spiritual breakdown in succession governance. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you why a will is a recipe for failure and why you need a biblical family constitution to save your legacy. Because a will tells your children what to do when you die, but a biblical family constitution teaches them how to live while you are still here. And that difference decides whether your legacy survives or disappears. Most people watching this have spent decades building something important: businesses, properties, savings, investments. You worked hard to create what I call a multi-generational treasury. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Many Christian families build net worth without building net wisdom. They plan inheritance, but they never design capital deployment for kingdom impact. And that is how wealth quietly collapses within 3 generations, not because the money was too small, but because the system was too weak. There is an old saying used by wealthy families and private advisors: shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Let me show you what that actually means. The first generation is the builder. This generation creates wealth through discipline, faith, sacrifice, and vision. They understand stewardship. They think long-term, much like the legacy-building mindset we see in figures such as Abraham, where wealth, faith, and covenant were connected. Builders do not just earn money, they carry responsibility. Then comes the second generation, the consumer. This generation inherits systems they did not build. They maintain the lifestyle, they continue the rituals, but slowly the conviction begins to fade. The wealth is still there, the assets remain, the accounts look strong, but something deeper begins to decline. The understanding behind the wealth begins to weaken. Traditions remain, but purpose becomes blurry. And then comes the third generation, the destroyer. This is where most legacies collapse, not because the family suddenly became poor, but because the heirs became disconnected from purpose. Entitlement grows, identity fades, mission disappears. This is what I call the entitlement virus, or the prodigal syndrome. And it reflects the deeper lesson behind the story of the prodigal son. That story was never only about a rebellious child. It was also about wealth transferred without governance, resources handed over without preparation, inheritance given without structure. Here is the deeper diagnosis that many families miss. The wealth often remains for a time, but the covenant is forgotten. There is a verse that quietly explains this entire pattern of generational collapse. Judges 2:10 describes a generation that rose after their fathers who no longer knew the Lord or what he had done. That verse is not only spiritual history, it is also a warning about legacy. Because when spiritual continuity disappears, financial continuity soon follows. Money alone cannot carry values. Systems must carry them. This is why families that protect their legacy do something different. They move away from inheritance thinking and into succession governance. They stop asking, how much money will we leave our children, and start asking, what kind of people must our children become to carry this legacy? That shift changes everything, because wealth that is not governed will eventually be consumed. This is where the concept of a biblical family office begins, a framework designed not just to manage money, but to protect legacy across generations. Most families only protect one form of capital, financial capital, but enduring families protect 3 forms of capital at the same time, because if you protect only the third, you will eventually lose all 3. The first is spiritual capital. This is the family's shared faith, mission, and covenant. It answers why the family exists and why resources were entrusted to them in the first place. Without spiritual capital, wealth becomes directionless and eventually destructive. The second is human capital. This includes the character, discipline, mindset, and abilities of the next generation. If heirs are not trained to lead, build, steward, and take responsibility, they will eventually consume what previous generations created. Wealth without wisdom is just a well-funded tragedy. The third is financial capital. This is the assets people usually focus on: businesses, investments, land, and savings. But here's the mistake many Christian families make. They protect the money, but they fail to build the people who must carry it. And that is exactly how the third-generation collapse begins. So, what is the first practical move families make when they understand this? Surprisingly, it is not updating a will. It is not buying another investment. It is not opening another trust. The first move is drafting a family mission statement. Because if your heirs do not understand the purpose behind the wealth, they will treat your life's work like a lottery win. A family mission statement answers three important questions. Why did God entrust this family with resources? What are we building across generations? And what responsibility does each generation carry to continue that mission? This is the beginning of a family constitution, not just a legal document, but a governance system that shapes how a family thinks, acts, and makes decisions. Let me say something that might change the way you think about wealth forever. Most families hire lawyers to protect their money, but very few appoint mentors to protect their legacy. And that is why collapse happens quietly, not through one bad decision, but through a slow loss of purpose, a gradual shift from stewardship to consumption.
Biblical stewardship was never about accumulating wealth simply for comfort. It was about establishing something that could serve generations, a multi-generational treasury designed for kingdom impact. Which means the goal is not simply to leave money behind. The goal is to leave structure, mission, identity, and governance. That is succession governance. That is how wealth becomes legacy instead of temporary success. So if you are serious about protecting your family's future, not just financially, but spiritually and structurally, then the time to begin is now. Because by the time wealth is transferred, it is already too late to teach stewardship. Most families fail because they have a lawyer for their money, but no mentor for their soul. If you want the biblical family constitution framework I use to prevent third-generation collapse, comment legacy below, and I will share the outline that serious families are using to protect what they have built. Because the goal is not just to leave wealth, the goal is to leave a legacy that still stands generations from now.